So here's a study that was done, I believe it was in Wisconsin a number of years ago, but just looking at the influence of some late emerging plants out there. So in this study, they planted the control, what they felt was their optimum planting date, nice uniform stand out there, full uniform stand, was their 100% of yield potential. When they planted a nice uniform stand a week and a half later, it yielded about 95% of what their optimum planting date did. When they planted a nice uniform stand 3 weeks later, it was 88%, about 90% of what the optimum planting date did. Then they came in and with some of those optimum planting date plants that were uniform out there, they went in and 25% of them they took out and planted it with another seed a week and a half later to simulate, late emerging plant, something that came up a week and a half later. When 25% of them in that stand were there, so they're not as competitive, 94%. So even though you had 75% of the stand was that optimum planting date, this didn't yield much better, or really any better, than if that whole field would have come up uniformly a week and a half later. That indicates that these plants that are coming up a week and a half later are not as productive as these plants in this uniform stand because of this plant-to-plant competition. It's keeping them suppressed. And then when they did the same thing, they got the optimum planting date, but they replaced 50% of the plants, so stimulating that half their stand came up a week and a half late, was 91%. So you're better off planting a week and a half late than to plant too early and have half your stand come up 10 days late. And then they did the same thing here with some of the 3-week planting windows. So 25% of the plants replaced 3 weeks later, coming up 3 weeks late. About the same yield as if the whole thing would have come up 3 weeks late. So again, there's enough competition from these earlier plants that 3-week plant is not very productive. Not near as productive as if all the plants would have been 3 weeks late. And then you can see that if 50% of the stand came up 3 weeks late, it's running just about 80% of the optimum planting rate. So some consequences for late emerging plants, and as you guys have said, a number of years ago we said, well, as long as it comes up within a week, we're probably okay. Anymore, it's tighter than that. It's probably 3 to 4 days, and this year I'd say 3 to 4 days was more variable than we would normally see. Typically what you'll see is on that tassel branch, you'll start shedding pollen from the top and work its way down toward the base. And you'll see, at the top and then on the branches, that first day it'll be the top 3 to 4 inches, next day it'll be the next 3 to 4 inches, and so forth until all the pollen's been shed out of that. Pollen, by the time you get up to 100 degrees, it's only viable for a few minutes. If you could have the temperature never really get much hotter than about 85 degrees or so, that pollen can stay viable for 12 hours. But you get up to 100 degrees and it's just a few minutes. What was the temperature like when we were pollinating this year? That's when we had some of our 100-degree days this year. So it's may have kind of abbreviated some of the pollen viability window that we had out there in a number of cases out there. So being aware of that. So that's really kind of why it tries to get most of it shed by around 10, 11 o'clock in the morning. It's trying to get that pollen shed out there before it gets too hot. The other issue is around the mass of pollen. So even though we had that abbreviated shed window and we may have had less viability out there, period of viability, but under most conditions, you don't need a tremendous amount of pollen to get good pollination. The studies have shown that the minimum pollen volume for perfect pollination is 100 grains per day on an area about the size of a dime. 100 grains isn't very much when you look at pollen, so it can be fairly sparse and still do pretty well. Now, the challenge is, I guess my question would be, is this that viability that's just a matter of minutes or 12-hour viability, you know, and what's the influence on that? So this minimum level with temperatures that aren't quite as excessive, I'm comfortable with. This minimum level under 100-degree days, 30-mile-an-hour wind, and single-digit humidity, I'm nervous. So, in this little demonstration, this first ear was just allowed to pollinate normally. The rest of these ears all had a shoot bag put on them, and you can see about the 5th row in, there's a little white bag on that ear on the end of the row here. That's a shoot bag. Plant breeders use it to try to control their pollination. They put it over the silk, and then they can bring pollen from a plant that they want and put it on there and cover that up so the silk doesn't get exposed to pollen that they don't want. So what they did in this demonstration is they put a shoot bag on each of these ears. And then so on day 1, what was happening is those silks were just about ready to poke through the end of the husk. That was day 1. Day 2, the first silks were poking through. They took the shoot bag off, let it pollinate for that 1 day, and then put the shoot bag on. So you can see which silk positions the silks were coming from. Starts to come from the butt silks first, or the first silks that you see coming out of that husk. This day 3, again, had the shoot bag on, so for this 1 day, shoot bag was taken off and put back on. So you can kind of see that, okay, all the kernels that were pollinated the first day, they're still viable silks out there, so they got pollinated, plus up the year, about a third of the way up the year. By day 4, 3/4 of the silks were exposed and could be pollinated. And you can see all the way across. By day 6 and 7, you could pretty much take the shoot bag off, pollinate for 1 day, and put the shoot bag on. And under the conditions that this demo was grown that year, you could pollinate that whole ear in 1 day. Look what happens by the time you get to about day 8 though. Those butt kernels, those first silks, starting to senesce. They haven't been fertilized yet, but they're starting to die off. You know, they're starting to collapse and give up after about a week. You know, if you haven't pollinated a silk in about a week, it's going to be a challenge for it out there. So you can kind of see as you move that through that, you know, it gets to be more and more of a challenge with some of those old silks out there. So you want to pollinate within about that first week of silk emergence if you can. So now we got the issue of, you know, okay, if we've got drier conditions out there, pollen is shedding, but the silks aren't emerging, what's the consequence to pollination that could be taking place out there, you know, and sometimes we see that under drought conditions. And that's one of the traits that breeders are really working on to improve drought tolerance in corn hybrids, is that even under that drought stress condition, these hybrids will still keep their synchrony of that pollen shed and silk emergence will still be very, very close. And that's a key trait, one of the key traits that they're working on for drought improvement. If we miss a few of the butt kernels here, usually there's enough assimilates being fed to that ear that we'll get a few more kernels that would set up on the tip than what we would normally get. Now, if you've got a hybrid that's a very fixed ear hybrid that tends to fill clear to the tip, obviously you don't have any extra tip to take advantage of. But you can do that a little bit. Whereas if you see an ear suck back from stress or something like that, abort some of these tip kernels, it'll help to get a larger kernel, but it won't fully offset that lack of kernels that you have out there. 80 to 85% of your yield is from the kernel number that you have out there. About 15% of your yield comes from the difference in the seed size that you have out there. So again, it gets a little bit back to some of this population that we're talking about. We want to get more kernels per acre out there. You know, I'll take a large kernel over a small kernel, you know, all things being equal on the same hybrid, you know, if it's happy. But if you're trying to manage some of those stress environments, what can we do to get more kernels on the ear versus getting bigger kernels later on? challenge is that the bigger kernels later on comes from this point on. You know, we're into the later grain fill stages. Managing or trying to think what we can do to influence the number of kernels we set up and down that ear is right through that, some of that early pollination stage. In a lot of conditions, if you're a dryland farmer, there's not much you can really do about it. But from an irrigation standpoint, manage your irrigation to where you're going into that pollination period at least a week ahead of pollination, and for the 2 weeks after pollination, keep that well watered and keep it as happy as you can out there.